So I was replaying Breath of the Wild for the, again. I was thinking about it from a game designer's perspective and how everybody's talking about all these new features in Breath of the Wild. And I'm thinking, there's actually nothing new in Breath of the Wild. All it did was retool mechanics that are already there in a way that better fit the overall progression and push of the game itself. Okay, stop. Let me explain myself. Now, I've talked to a few people about this, and the first thing they say is, well, that's silly. You can't stop time in other Zelda games. That's a mechanic that's never, ever been in a Zelda game before. But then I just point out, and I'm like, listen, in Zelda 1, you just find a clock, and you stop time. So, it has been in a Zelda game before. They've just retooled it and reimagined it. Oh, but you can't climb everything in Zelda. You can only climb certain things. In Breath of the Wild, you can climb everything. And while you certainly can climb a whole lot more things in Zelda, Breath of the Wild, you can't climb everything. If you've ever been in a shrine or tried to climb Guardian technology outside of the castle, you realize that not everything is climbable. Only some things are climbable. Now, the difference is Zelda has taken select climbing points and said that most everything is a select climbing point, which really helped heighten the sense of adventure and really helped you pick your own path. But they still just took that same idea where sometimes you just climb a surface in Zelda to get somewhere, and they just applied it to more things. They've retooled that same mechanic. Broken swords, you say? Well, obviously you've never met the small Big Goron who sells the shoddy Big Goron sword and had your heart broken and your rupees wasted as you shatter the Big Goron sword in Ocarina of Time. And picking up enemies' weapons and throwing enemy weapons is actually something that you can do in Wind Waker. It's a very big part of the game, and it's a ton of fun. And what they've done in Breath of the Wild is they've taken that feeling of having a weapon break, the need to find new weapons, which is something inherent to Zelda, and they mixed it with Wind Waker's ability to pick up other weapons and throw other weapons, and now you have a system where you have to constantly adventure to find new weapons that you're gonna break. But there's no memories in other games. In Zelda games, there's cutscenes for sure, but you're not searching out memories. But in Majora's Mask, you pick up the Ocarina, which triggers a memory where you actually learn an important song. The memory is actually part of the progression, similar to Breath of the Wild. They've taken that idea of stumbling across something that reminds you of a moment in your past to help you with game progression. What about Sheikah Towers? Well, you're really going to argue to me that finding maps in interesting places is something new to the Zelda franchise? In fact, Wind Waker takes that idea and runs with it. You even have to climb to the top of a tower to get your maps transcribed from an ancient Hylian language from Tingle. Sound familiar? But there's no crafting in other Zelda games. Well, I get that a lot of people skip Skyward Sword, but you can actually craft in Skyward Sword and improve your items. Do you need to? No, if you're any kind of good at the game, you can probably just get through with the base items, but you can craft, and you can also turn things into potions and make better potions. You have to go to the hub world to do this, though. All they've done is change the fact that you need to go to a hub world and just find a place, a cooking pot, and do it all yourself. So monster parts, though. You don't usually pick up monster parts in other games, except you do in Wind Waker. Going anywhere you want right at the beginning of the game, well, that's even more the case in Zelda 1. You can even get to level 9, but you can't actually get inside of level 9 without the Triforce. But you are immediately getting directly to the plot. There are no side quests. Every single thing is a method to get pieces of the Triforce so you can confront Ganon right from the get-go. Jumping off high places and using a paraglider. You think you got me there unless you played Skyward Sword and used the sailcloth. They even have the sailcloth in some of the demo versions of Breath of the Wild where they started retooling everything from earlier Zelda games. Really, the paraglider in Breath of the Wild is just mixing the sailcloth idea with the Deku Leaf already in Wind Waker. Man, Wind Waker's coming up a lot. Even the plot takes things from earlier Zelda games, because Zelda upset at her failing to save Hyrule is the plot point behind Twilight Princess. Mipha and Link's broken Zora engagement? Well, that happens in Ocarina of Time when you meet Ruto again as an adult. Eating to gain health. Oh, you think you got me there, except eating a crap ton of apples just so you won't die is actually something you can do in A Link to the Past, where you can actually get apples from a tree and eat them. Little puzzles scattered all over the world so you can solve them and find inventory slots is actually in Skyward Sword. There are goddess cubes everywhere. You have to find out how to get to them because they're in odd places. Once you get to them, you have to find out how to get to them again in the Skyward world, and oftentimes they're giving you inventory slots and pieces of heart. So then maybe you're saying, but yeah, I get that there's little puzzles scattered everywhere in Skyward Sword, but you couldn't find Koroks. Finding Koroks in their little seeds in Wind Waker is part of the game. But stamina is so important in Breath of the Wild. But you also have stamina as a very important part of the game in Skyward Sword. Oh, but malice taking over enemies. That's in Skyward Sword. Oh, but here's a big one. You start the game after you get through the tutorial segment. You start the game with all the items accessible to you. You also start the game with all the items accessible to you in A Link Between Worlds. That was kind of its whole gimmick. Weird flying dragon deities. While you have interacted with many deities in Zelda games before, a weird flying deity is actually something that you interact with in Skyward Sword in a very similar fashion. However, this one looks more like the Windfish. So if you want to count the Windfish, we can even say this started in Link to the Past. Armor upgrades. Zelda 1. Having to change something about your character to interact with extreme situations like extreme weather started in Ocarina of Time. You could almost argue that shock arrows are new, but they're really just a retooling of the light arrow, where they split the light arrow into two pieces, where in Ocarina of Time the light arrow really works more like a shock arrow, but in Breath of the Wild the light arrow is more of just something that you use to defeat the dummy boss at the end of the game. Oh, but there's new enemies in Breath of the Wild, like Guardians. Guardians are new. Guardians are just Beamoses with legs. In fact, they're even called Guardians in Skyward Sword. Changing weather? Well, we could look at the Legend of Zelda Oracle of Seasons. In fact, when you change the weather, it changes everything about the world around it. Or you could argue that in Ocarina of Time, when you have the day and night cycles, that actually changes how the world works. The entire world responds differently in day and in night. The thing is, Breath of the Wild did retool it. It now has a more systemic and organic way that the weather and the rain and the NPCs and everybody reacts to it. But you could argue that these weather systems and day and night systems are in a primitive form in Ocarina of Time, because whether or not NPCs are outside or inside heavily depends on if it's day or night, and the day and night system happens organically when you're outside, and even certain and different enemies come out at night. And wondering, well, the rain didn't do much in Ocarina of Time. You're right, it didn't do much, but the idea that the rain did affect something in the real world was there, because when you planted a magic bean, you could either water it with water from a jar, or you could play the Song of Storms, and playing the Song of Storms would water the magic bean, which means that the game responded to the weather. So these systems are in the designer's brains years ago. They're just readapting them for Breath of the Wild. They're making them better fit the overall push of a Zelda game. Oh, you're thinking I got them, and you're already typing in the comments, yeah, but you didn't steal abilities from dead people in other Zelda games, except you did. You did. That's what Majora's Mask is about, is stealing abilities from dead people who have lingering regrets. Spirit orbs are just an abstraction of the Piece of Heart system. Shrines are neutered dungeons. Finding the Master Sword in a state of disrepair is a lot of Zelda games. I Link to the Past for one of them, the first game the Master Sword appears in. Getting somewhere high and finding out where to go is actually one of the hopes that you would do in Skyward Sword. The game design fell a little short, with the dowsing ability really never being used, but it was hoped to be there. The Sheikah Slate, using the console as a reason to imitate the UI in the game is used in Wind Waker when you have the Tingle Tuner to summon Tingle and your Game Boy Advance is hooked up to your GameCube so your friend can play too and waste all your rupees. Taking pictures in a Zelda game is doable in Majora's Mask and Wind Waker. So I think there's even more things that you guys might think, but I challenge you to leave them in the comments and I will see if I can point out how you're wrong, because I'm pretty sure you're wrong. Because I think the big risk with Breath of the Wild wasn't adding new mechanics like everybody talks about. The big risk was changing all the things from the older Zelda games. They took all the things that we knew and we loved and they changed them, and that was scary. They were doing all of these changes in a very different way that really makes the game feel and flow differently than other Zelda games. I think it's an important lesson to think that just because something feels new about a game doesn't necessarily mean it's new. That changing the way you approach a mechanic can really drastically change how your game feels, how it plays, how it works. And that's the lesson I hope we get from this. Also, I hope it was fun just to talk about some Zelda nostalgia and where it shows back up again. Eagerly awaiting Breath of the Wild 2 with you guys. Let's hope the dungeons come back. I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for joining us. This is Space Dodo, where we talk about games we like that influence our game design philosophies and the games we're currently designing.